There was a dead silence that settled over Seoul after midnight. Not the silence of emptiness. The city was never empty, but the silence of agreement. An unspoken understanding passed between the humans moving through those glittering streets and the others who moved among them, that the night belonged to everyone and that everyone would behave accordingly. It was a fragile thing, that agreement. The kind of peace that exists, not because conflict has been resolved, but because both sides have decided, for now, that the alternative is worse. Seoul had built more than most to hold it together. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, 70 floors above the city, a glass of deep red liquid held loosely in one hand, watching Seoul breathe beneath him, the way a man watches something he loves and does not entirely trust. The lights stretched in every direction like a second sky, a mirror of stars pressed flat against the earth. And somewhere down in all that, brilliance, humans and vampires were sharing the same streets, the same restaurants, the same air, performing the careful choreography of coexistence that had taken decades to build. His company alone employed thousands, humans and vampires side by side, drawing salaries, attending meetings, filing reports, existing in the ordinary machinery of a working world without incident. It had not been easy. It had required a particular kind of discipline, a willingness to step out of the shadows that his kind had hidden in for centuries and say, "We are here. We have always been here, and we do not want war." Most of his kind had followed his lead. Most. He set the glass down on the windowsill and pressed his fingers lightly against the cold glass. Below him, something was moving through the streets that didn't quite fit the rhythm of the night. Cars, more than usual for this hour. People gathered at corners and clusters that had nothing to do with nightlife. He had learned, across his centuries, to notice when a pattern broke, and something in the pattern of tonight was broken. His phone buzzed on the table behind him. He didn't turn immediately. He kept his eyes on the street below, watching the clusters grow, watching the cars slow and stop in formations that were beginning to look less like traffic and more like... The phone buzzed again, and again. And then, every phone in his penthouse was making noise, and the television on the wall flickered to life on its own, the emergency broadcast cutting through every channel simultaneously, and the voice that came through the speakers was calm in the particular practiced way of someone trained to sound calm while delivering the end of the world. He turned around. The screen showed fire, not his street. 3 blocks away, an entire building consumed. The flames so high they looked like they were trying to reach the same sky his penthouse touched. And in the lower corner of the screen, a news ticker scrolled words that he read once and then again, because the first time his mind refused to process them. Coordinated attacks reported across 17 vampire-occupied districts. Human coalition groups claim responsibility. Authorities urge calm. He was already moving before the ticker finished scrolling. He crossed the penthouse in 3 strides, the ancient part of him rising to the surface and sharpening everything. His hearing stretched outward through the walls and caught it all at once. Footsteps in the stairwells, multiple floors, moving upward with coordinated purpose that had nothing to do with evacuation. The distant sound of breaking glass from somewhere below, and underneath all of it, spreading through the bones of the building itself, the low, greedy crackle of fire that had already found the lower floors and was making its way up with patient, terrible appetite. He moved through the penthouse with controlled urgency, his mind already calculating exits, already mapping the fastest route down and out. But even as he moved, even as every survival instinct he had honed across centuries fired at once, there was something else. A pull. A presence in the building that his senses locked onto the way, a compass locks onto north. Insistent. Undeniable. He turned toward the corridor that led to the inner rooms, calling out, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who has never needed to raise it. No answer. He moved faster. The smoke was beginning to find its way through the ventilation now, thin fingers of it curling along the ceiling, and the temperature of the building was rising in a way that told him the fire below was not small and was not slowing down. He called out again, pushing through the corridor, his hand finding the door at the end and throwing it open. The room was empty. Something cold moved through him. He turned, retracing his steps, moving faster, the smoke thickening, the building beginning to groan around him in the way. Buildings groan when their bones are compromised. He searched every room, refusing to panic, pulling open every door, checking every corner, searching for the presence his instincts had told him was here. She was not here. He stood in the center of his burning penthouse, and for one single moment, the ancient, powerful, untouchable thing that he was became something much simpler. A man. Standing in the middle of a loss he didn't have time to measure. Then the ceiling came down. Not all of it. A section directly above him, giving way with a sound like the world splitting along a fault line. And the burning debris came fast and total, and he threw his arms up. But the fire took him. Really took him. The way fire takes something it has been patient about. And the pain was absolute and blinding and all-consuming, and then nothing. No sound, no heat, no city, just darkness, pressing in from every side, thick and complete and endless, and then, slowly, warmth, not the warmth of fire, something gentler, something that came from above rather than below. His fingers moved first, pressing down against something beneath them and finding earth, soil, the particular texture of ground that has never known, concrete or steel. His chest rose, fell, rose again. The sounds came next, voices, many of them. A language his dazed mind reached for and struggled to fully hold. The movement of feet against unpaved ground. Animals. The smell of spices and raw meat and open fire used for cooking rather than destruction. The sounds of a world doing the ordinary business of being alive. And then, the pain hit him. All at once, like his body had been waiting for his mind to catch up before delivering the full report. His arms, his back, the side of his face, the particular deep ache of a body that has been through something it barely survived. He tried to push himself upright, and the effort sent white sparks across his vision. But he held on, grinding his teeth, pressing his palms flat against the earth, until he was sitting. He opened his eyes. The sun was high and merciless overhead. Around him, the sounds he had heard resolved themselves into a scene his mind had absolutely no framework for. A market. Open, sprawling, loud with the commerce of 100 transactions happening at once. But not any market he recognized. The stalls were built from wood and woven grass. The clothing on the bodies moving through it belonged to no era his memory could place. And he reached for that memory now. Grabbed for it the way a drowning man grabs for anything solid, and found nothing. He searched inside himself with rising desperation. His name, his face, where he had come from, who he was before the heat and the dark and this moment of sitting in the dirt of a market that made no sense. He searched every corner of himself and came back with the same answer every time. Empty. Just the ghost of fire on his skin, just the pain in his body, just the sounds of a world that did not know him and the growing awareness that he did not know it either. He became aware, gradually, that he was being watched. The market had not stopped. Life continued its loud transaction around him. But a circle had formed, loose, cautious, the way people gather around something they are curious about, but not willing to touch. Men, women, children, all in that same unfamiliar clothing, all looking at him with expressions that ranged from suspicion to discomfort, to the particular studied blankness of people who have decided that whatever this is, it is not their responsibility. His clothes were burned and torn, barely holding together, dark with soot and in places with blood. He looked, he understood distantly, exactly like what he was. A man who had come from somewhere terrible and arrived here with nothing. A woman near the edge of the circle murmured something to the man beside her, and they moved away, pulling their child with them. Two men in the middle distance looked at him, exchanged a word, and turned back to their transaction. An elder walked past the circle, glanced at him once, and kept walking with the unhurried certainty of someone who has seen enough of the world's strangeness to no longer be delayed by it. He tried to speak. His mouth opened, and what came out was barely a sound. Dry, cracked, the voice of someone who had swallowed smoke and heat. He tried again, reaching for words, and the words that came were wrong for this place. He could see it in the faces of the few still watching, the way confusion layered over their wariness. Nobody moved toward him. Nobody reached down. The circle began to thin. One by one, the curious drifted back into the business of their day, the spectacle of him apparently not worth the disruption of their morning. He sat in the dirt and watched them go. This man with no name and no memory, and no understanding of where or when he was. The pain in his body settling into something chronic and insistent, the space behind his eyes where his entire life should have been ringing, with a silence so loud it had almost become its own kind of sound. And then, the circle was nearly empty. And then, there were only a few remaining. And then, from somewhere at the edge of what was left of the small gathered crowd, there was movement. Someone pushing gently through, and a pair of feet appeared in front of him and stopped. He raised his eyes slowly, following upward from those feet, and found a young woman standing before him. A black woman, beautiful in the way that has nothing to do with effort, with a belly round and full with the very end of a pregnancy that she carried with the quiet dignity of someone long accustomed to holding heavy things. She was looking down at him with an expression that was not pity, and was not fear, and was not the careful, studied indifference everyone else had offered him. She was simply looking at him, like she was trying to understand something about him that his appearance alone wasn't telling her. And in her eyes, steady and dark and unhurried, was something that the market and the crowd and this entire incomprehensible morning had not yet offered him. Something that looked impossibly like compassion. Chapter 2. The woman who stopped. She crouched down in front of him, and for a moment she said nothing. She just looked at him, the way most people in that market had refused to. Her eyes moved over the burns on his arms, the dried blood at his temple, the torn and ruined state of everything he was wearing, and her expression did not shift into disgust or discomfort. It stayed open, steady, like she was looking at a person and not a problem. "You are hurt," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was calm and low, carrying the particular evenness of a woman who has learned to keep herself steady in situations that would unravel others. He opened his mouth. What came out was barely a sound, dry and cracked, the voice of someone who had swallowed smoke and heat and silence in equal measure. She waited. She didn't fill the space with nervous words or pull back from the rawness of him. She simply waited, with a patience that felt practiced and genuine at the same time. "I don't—" he started. He stopped. The words felt wrong in his mouth, clumsy, like he was handling something he hadn't held in a long time. "I don't know where I am." She studied him for a moment. "Can you stand?" He wasn't sure, but he nodded anyway. She extended her hand. He looked at it. This woman, heavily pregnant, offering her hand to a grown man twice her size, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And something moved through him that he had no name for. He took her hand. She steadied him as he found his feet, absorbing more of his weight than she should have without so much as adjusting her expression. When he was upright, she looked him over once, nodded to herself, and said, "Come." She didn't wait to see if he would follow. She simply turned and walked. He followed. She led him away from the noise of the market, down a dirt road that curved through the settlement. She walked with one hand resting on the round weight of her belly, moving carefully but without self-pity, the walk of a woman who has somewhere to be and intends to get there. He walked beside her, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was simply what it was. When they arrived at her home, she stopped at the side of the house rather than the door. There was a low wooden bench against the outer wall, beneath the shade of the roof's wide overhang, and she pointed at it. "Sit here," she said. He sat. She disappeared inside. He looked around at the compound. Modest, clean, carefully kept in the way that people keep things when they have little but take pride in it regardless. The settlement sounds drifted over the walls. Somewhere nearby, a child was laughing. Somewhere further away, something was being cooked over fire, and the smell of it reached him and made him aware, sharply and suddenly, of how empty he was. She came back with water in a clay vessel and held it out without a word. He took it and drank, and the water was warm and tasted of earth and was the most real thing that had happened to him since he opened his eyes to this sky. "Thank you," he said when he was done. She nodded, taking the vessel back. Then she went inside again and returned with food, warm and simply prepared, set in front of him on a broad leaf, with the same quiet efficiency she seemed to apply to everything. She stood back and watched him eat, not intrusively, just present. He ate. And as he ate, he became aware that she was studying him with a kind of careful, unhurried curiosity. "Where are you from?" she asked. He stopped chewing. He searched. One more time, with a desperation he was beginning to feel embarrassed by, and found the same terrible emptiness waiting for him on the other side of the question. "I don't know," he said. She did not react the way he expected. She did not look at him with suspicion or pull back from the strangeness of the answer. She simply absorbed it, the way she seemed to absorb everything, quietly and without drama, What is your name? He looked at her. I don't remember. The words sat between them in the afternoon air. He braced for something. Doubt, discomfort, the careful withdrawal of kindness from someone who had decided he was more complicated than they signed up for. Instead, she was quiet for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. Then she said, You don't remember anything? No, he said. He paused. He pressed his hand briefly against his forearm where the burn marks were darkest. Just this. She looked at the burns, stood up, and went inside without another word. What is wrong with me? He thought, watching the doorway she had disappeared through. I am sitting in a place I don't recognize, in a time I don't understand, and I cannot even tell this woman my name. I have nothing. I am nothing. The thought settled over him like the smoke he could still somehow feel in his lungs, heavy and suffocating. And he sat with it, because there was nothing else to do. She came back carrying a small clay bowl. The smell hit him before she was close. Sharp, herbal, medicinal. She crouched beside him on the bench, dipped her fingers into the bowl, and without asking permission or making ceremony of it, she began applying the mixture to the burns on his arms. The herbs bit into the damaged skin with a cold, clarifying sting. He held still. Her hands were steady, not rough, not overly gentle, just focused and sure. He watched her work and felt, from somewhere deep in the hollow silence of his lost memory, something stir. Not a vision, not a sound, just a feeling, warm and sourceless, rising through him like heat through floorboards, gone before he could turn his full attention to it. What is that? He thought. Why does this feel familiar? She is a stranger. I have never been here before. I have never met her before. Have I? The thought unnerved him, and he pushed it away. When she was done, she sat back and looked at his arms with the critical eye of someone checking their own work. Then she looked up at him. They will heal, she said. The herbs will help. Thank you, he said again. The words felt insufficient. He was aware, sharply, of how much she had already given a man she owed nothing to. You didn't have to do this. She looked at him with an expression that was direct without being unkind. No, she agreed simply. I didn't. She stood and went inside one more time. When she came back, she was carrying a folded set of men's clothing. She held it out to him. My husband's, she said. You cannot walk around in what you are wearing. He took the clothes and looked at them, then looked at himself, then looked at her with an expression that communicated the obvious problem. The faintest trace of dry amusement crossed her face. It is what I have, she said. He changed behind the side of the house as best he could, moving carefully around the protests of his damaged body. And when he emerged, the clothes were doing their best, but the strain across his shoulders and chest told the whole story. She looked at him standing there, the borrowed fabric pulling in every direction it had not been designed to pull. And that same faint trace of amusement returned to her eyes, brief and quiet, like sunlight crossing a floor. It disappeared quickly. She reached back inside the door and produced a bundle wrapped in broad leaves, tied neatly with a strip of cloth. Food, she said, holding it out. For the road. He took it. He looked at her. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. And the afternoon settled around them with the golden, slanted light of a sun beginning its descent. And he became aware that this was the end of something. That she had given everything she intended to give, and the kindness she had extended to him had reached its natural boundary. He did not want to leave. The realization arrived without warning and settled in his chest with a weight that made no sense. He did not know this woman. He did not know her name or her life or anything about the world she moved through. He had no reason, no logical, justifiable reason, to feel that stepping away from her compound and onto that road was the wrong direction. And yet, "Go well," she said. Her voice was kind. He nodded. "Thank you," he said, for the third time. And this time, the words carried everything he could not say with them. He turned and walked away down the road. He walked until the sounds of her compound faded behind him. He walked until the settlement thinned and the road opened up, and there was nothing in front of him but the road itself and the vast, indifferent sky above it, and the fact of having nowhere to go. He stopped. Nowhere, he thought. There is nowhere. There is no direction that means anything. There is no one waiting. There is nothing in any direction that belongs to me or that I belong to. He stood there with the food bundle in his hand and the ghost of fire on his skin and the hollow space where his entire life used to be. And the loneliness of it was so absolute and so complete that for a moment he simply stood inside it without moving, without thinking, without trying to find a way out of it. Then he turned around. He told himself it was because he had nowhere else to go. He told himself the direction was arbitrary, that he was simply a man without a destination, choosing one road over another for no particular reason. He walked back toward the settlement slowly, keeping to the edge of the road, staying in the shadow of the trees that lined it. And when her compound came back into view, he did not go to the door. He found the cluster of trees that sat close enough to see the compound clearly, and he sat down against the base of one of them, his back against the bark. Just for tonight, he told himself, just until I figure out where to go. He sat with a food bundle in his lap, and the evening deepened around him, and the sky went from gold to amber to the deep, bruised purple of approaching night. The settlement wound down around him, fires being lit, voices dropping to the quieter register of evening, the particular exhale of a community ending its day. He breathed. He watched the door of her compound without examining too closely why his eyes kept returning to it. He told himself again that it was just the direction he happened to be facing. Why does she feel important? He thought, and the question had no answer, and he sat with the absence of the answer and the darkening sky and the sounds of the night settling in. The fire in front of her compound burned low, and then the door swung open. A man came out, heavy on his feet, graceless, his movements carrying the particular aggressive looseness of someone whose drinking had passed the point of pleasure a long time ago and arrived somewhere meaner. He stood in the compound and looked around as though he had forgotten why he came outside. Then he called out, his voice thick and blurred and too loud for the quiet of the night. "Woman!" A moment later, she appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been resting. There was a softness to her movements that hadn't been there in the afternoon. But she was alert now, standing in the frame of the door with the careful, measured posture of a woman who has learned to read a room before she enters it. She read him quickly. Seoryang, watching from the trees, saw the reading happen in real time. The subtle adjustment of her shoulders, the way her face settled into something neutral and careful. "You were speaking to someone today," the man said. His eyes were unfocused, but his voice carried the particular dangerous edge of a drunk who has found something to be angry about. Who were you speaking to? A stranger who needed help, she said. Her voice was even, careful. He is gone now. A man. It was not a question. His voice dropped in a way that was somehow louder than shouting. You were giving my clothes to a man. He was hurt, she said. He had nothing. I gave him what we could spare. You gave him what we could spare. He repeated it slowly, turning it over, tasting the shape of something to be angry about. You gave away my things without asking me. You were not here to ask, she said, still carefully, still measured, still holding the line of her own calm with both hands. He stepped toward her. Seoryang's entire body went rigid in the shadow of the trees. Do not, she started. His hand moved, fast and hard, and the sound of it cut through the quiet of the night like something snapping. And she went back against the door frame, and the sound she made, or rather, didn't make, was worse than any scream. The absorbed silence of someone taking pain they have learned not to give voice to. Seoryang was on his feet, but before he could move, she was already pulling herself upright, already straightening, already lifting her face, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, stripped of everything except the bare, urgent core of what she needed to say. I am bleeding, she said. Her voice was low and shaking, but her eyes were direct. The baby, something is wrong. You need to take me to the midwives, please. She reached out and gripped his arm. Please, we will lose the child. The man looked down at her hand on his arm. The silence stretched, and then he pulled his arm free. He looked at her hand like it had offended him. He said something low and vicious that Seoryang was close enough to hear clearly, the words ugly and small and designed to diminish. And then he turned and walked back into the house. The door swung shut behind him. She stood in the compound alone, her hand still outstretched toward the space where he had been. The firelight caught the dark stains spreading against her hanbok, and Seoryang's chest turned to stone. She looked down at herself. She looked at the closed door. She looked out into the dark with the face of a woman who has just calculated every option available to her and found them all gone. Then a voice came from the darkness just beyond the compound. I will take you. She spun around. He was already moving toward her out of the shadow of the trees, the food bundle abandoned on the ground behind him, his eyes on her and nothing else. She stared at him. This stranger, this man with no name who she had fed and clothed and sent away, standing in her compound in the middle of the night, like he had never left. You, she started. There is no time, he said. He reached her and looked at the stain on her hanbok, and something moved through his face that he didn't have the words to explain and didn't try to. Tell me where to go. I will carry you. She looked at him for one long moment, searching his face with those steady, dark eyes, looking for something, finding whatever it was she needed to find. The midwife's chamber, she said. East Road, past the old fig tree. You will see the light. He bent and lifted her before she finished the sentence. She gasped, more from surprise than anything else, and grabbed his shoulder. And he turned and moved out of the compound and onto the road and broke into a run. And the night swallowed them both. And behind them, the fire in the compound burned low and indifferent, and the door of the house stayed shut. And as Seoryang ran through the dark with this woman in his arms, this stranger, this woman whose name he didn't even know yet, he became aware of something that stopped his breath, even as his legs kept moving. He was terrified, not of the dark, not of the unfamiliar road, not of the century pressing in around him from every direction. He was terrified of the weight in his arms becoming still. Why? He thought desperately as he ran, his eyes finding the east road, searching the dark for the light she had described. Why does this feel like this? Who are you to me? Who are you? The old fig tree appeared out of the dark, and he turned east without slowing. And ahead of him, exactly where she said it would be, a warm light burned in a window. He ran harder. Chapter 3. The Cost of Waiting. The midwife's chamber was a low, wide building set back from the east road, its walls the color of dried earth, a single light burning steadily in the window, the way a lighthouse burns, not for beauty, but for necessity. Seoryung pushed through the door with a daisy in his arms, and the two women inside moved before he could speak. They had seen this before. They knew what blood and urgency looked like when it came through a door. "Put her here," the older one said, already clearing the low cot against the wall, her hands moving with the brisk efficiency of someone whose compassion had long ago stopped being loud and become instead a thing expressed entirely through action. He laid Adaze down carefully. She was conscious. Barely. Her eyes were open and finding his face, and there was something in them that was trying to be brave and not entirely succeeding. Her hand found his wrist as he straightened up, her grip weak but present. "Stay," she said. The word was barely a breath. The older midwife stepped between them, already assessing, already pressing careful hands to Adaezi's abdomen, her expression shifting in the way that experienced faces shift when they find something they were hoping not to find. She looked at her younger colleague, and something passed between them without words. Then she looked at Seoryang. "Who are you to her?" she asked. Her voice was not unkind, but it was direct. This was not a room for anything except the truth. "I brought her here," he said. It was not an answer to the question she had asked. They both knew it. The older midwife held his gaze for a moment, reading him the way Adaze had read him that afternoon, thoroughly and without flinching. Then she said, "We need her husband. We cannot do what needs to be done without his word. The law requires it." She turned to the younger one. "Go. Quickly." The younger midwife was already out the door. The older one turned back to Adaez and resumed her work and then looked at Seoryang over her shoulder. "Outside," she said, not cruelly, just clearly. He looked at Adaezi. Her eyes were still on him, that weak grip still at his wrist. "Go," Adaezi said softly. "It is all right." It was not all right. He could see that it was not all right. But he had no standing in this room and no authority in this world, and nothing to offer except the fact of his presence, which the midwife had just told him was required outside rather than in. He uncurled Adaez's fingers from his wrist gently, and her hand fell back to the cot, and he turned and walked out into the night. The door closed behind him. He stood outside in the dark and listened to what he could hear through the walls. Movement, the older midwife's voice low and constant, Adaez making sounds that she was clearly trying not to make. And the helplessness of it pressed down on him from every direction like something physical. He paced the length of the building. He stopped. He pressed his back against the wall and tipped his head back and stared at the sky. "There is nothing I can do," he thought. "I am standing out here and she is in there, and there is absolutely nothing I can do." And then From somewhere beneath that thought, something else rose, faint at first, like a smell carried on wind from a great distance. The sense, not a memory exactly, but the shape of one, of a time when standing outside a door and being helpless would not have been the only option available to him. A feeling in his blood, in the marrow of him, of something that used to live there that no longer did, something powerful, something that operated by entirely different rules than the ones this body was currently bound by. He pressed his hand flat against the wall of the building and frowned at the ground, chasing the feeling. I had something, he thought. I don't know what it was. I don't know what I was. But I had something, and it is gone, and if it were here, if whatever I used to be were here tonight instead of this, she would not be lying in there waiting for a man who should already be running. The thought arrived with a bitterness so sharp it surprised him. The ghost of an ability he could not name, in the hands of a man he could not remember being, taunting him from the other side of a memory he could not access. He had been something that did not stand outside doors and wait, something that could have helped her. He pushed off the wall and paced again. Where was the husband? The younger midwife had been gone long enough. The night was deep and still, and the light in the window was the only warm thing in it. And from inside the building, the sounds had changed. Quieter now, more concentrated, the particular tense quiet of people working against something that is working against them. Hurry up, he thought, directed at a man he had never met, with a ferocity that surprised him. She does not have time for whatever you are doing. She does not have time. He heard him before he saw him. Footsteps on the east road, unhurried, uneven, carrying the familiar, graceless rhythm of a man whose body was still navigating the after effects of too much drink. The younger midwife appeared first, almost pulling the man along behind her, her face tight with an urgency she was barely containing. The husband came into the light of the window, and Seoryang looked at him and felt something cold and clarifying move through his chest. This was the man who had left her on the ground. He was not running. He was not even walking quickly. He moved toward the door of the midwife's chamber with the particular, unhurried air of someone who has been inconvenienced and wants that known. His eyes unfocused, his mouth set in the sullen line of a man interrupted from something he considered more important. Seoryang stepped back into the shadow of the wall. He did not trust what his face was doing. The husband pushed through the door without looking at him. Seoryang stood outside and listened. The older midwife's voice came through the wall. Low, professional, stripped of the judgment she was almost certainly feeling. She explained the situation. She explained what needed to be done. And then she said the words that turned the night to stone. "We can save one," she said. "Your wife or the child. The delay has made it impossible to guarantee both. You must choose." Silence. Seoryang pressed himself against the wall, every part of him still. The husband's voice came back, and the speed of it was the most devastating thing about it. No hesitation, no pause that might have indicated the weight of the decision was being felt at all. "Save the child," he said. "The woman can die." Outside, Seoryang closed his eyes. Inside, the older midwife said nothing. The younger one said nothing. They had heard this before. Not these exact words, perhaps, but this exact man, in every form he took across every household in the settlement. The whole community knew. Everyone knew. And so, Neither of them looked surprised, and neither of them argued, and the husband took his answer as confirmation and settled himself against the far wall of the chamber with the self-satisfied air of a man who has handled something efficiently. The midwives went back to work, and behind the husband's back, with the quiet, deliberate solidarity of women who have learned to save lives inside the boundaries of laws that don't always deserve their respect, they fought for both. Seoryang paced outside. He counted his own footsteps to keep his mind from going to the places it wanted to go. He looked at the sky. He looked at the road. He looked at the light in the window and watched it the way you watch the last candle in a dark room, with the specific terror of someone who knows what the dark looks like and does not want to go back to it. Time moved the way time moves in waiting rooms and battlefields, not in minutes, but in textures. The texture of hoping, the texture of dreading, the texture of listening so hard to the sounds coming through a wall that your whole body becomes an ear. And then, silence. A different kind of silence. The silence that follows the end of effort, rather than the silence that precedes it. Seoryang stopped pacing. The door opened. The older midwife stepped out. She looked at him, and in her eyes was the particular exhausted grief of someone who has fought as hard as they could and not won everything they fought for. She did not speak to him. She went back inside. He already knew. He stood in the dark outside the window and pressed his fist against the wall and held it there. And the feeling in his chest was enormous and sourceless and made no sense by any logic available to him, and he did not try to make sense of it. He just stood there and felt it and let it be as large as it needed to be. Inside, he heard the midwife speak to the husband, heard her tell him in the same low, professional voice that his wife had survived, that the child had not. A beat of silence. Then the husband's footsteps crossed the floor. Seoryang moved to the doorway and stood in it, not entering, just present, just watching. The husband stood over Idaisy's cot. She was alive. He could see the rise and fall of her chest from where he stood, but barely. Her face was pale, her body utterly spent, every resource she had poured into surviving the night. Her eyes were closed. The husband looked at her, and then his eyes dropped to the scar. It ran across her lower stomach, the mark left by the hands that had cut her open trying to keep her in the world. Seoryang watched the husband's face as he looked at it, and what he saw there was not relief, not grief, not the complicated wreckage of a man who had just lost a child and nearly lost a wife in the same night. What he saw was disgust. Adazi's eyes opened slowly. She found the ceiling first, then found her husband standing over her. Something in her face reached toward him, some last, exhausted instinct toward the person who was supposed to be her safe place in the world. He looked down at her with cold, flat eyes. "You survived," he said. His voice carried no warmth, no relief, just the bare observation of a fact he was deciding what to do with. She said nothing. She was too weak for words. His eyes dropped back to the scar. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at her face, and when he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate, every word placed carefully. A man who wanted to make sure he was understood. "Do not come back to my home with that thing on your body," he said. "I will not share my bed with a woman who is torn apart like damaged cloth. You are marked. You are ruined." He leaned slightly closer, and his voice dropped further. intimate in the way that cruelty sometimes is. You could not keep my child alive, and you could not even keep your body whole. What exactly are you good for? He straightened up. He looked at the midwives, both of whom were very still, their faces carefully blank in the way of people who have learned that reacting only makes things worse for the woman left behind after they leave. He said nothing to them. He turned and walked to the door, and his footsteps were as unhurried going out as they had been coming in. The door swung shut behind him. The chamber was silent. Adaze lay on the cot with her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. She did not cry. She did not make a sound. She simply lay there in the wreckage of the night, in the body that had fought so hard to stay alive, with the echo of his words settling over her like wave over something that has already burned. And in the doorway, Seoryang stood very still. He had no words. He had no power. He had no memory of who he was, or where he had come from, or what he had once been capable of. He had nothing. Nothing except the full, unobstructed view of what he had just witnessed, and a feeling in his chest so enormous and so ancient that it had stopped feeling like an emotion and started feeling like a place he recognized, a place he had been before. He did not know how he knew that. Chapter 4. The Walk Home. The days that followed were the quietest Seoryang had known since waking up in this century. He made a place for himself in the cluster of trees across from the midwife's chamber, a hollow between two thick roots, where the ground was flat enough to sleep on, and the canopy above was dense enough to provide cover from the occasional rain that moved through in the afternoons. He had nothing. No blanket, no fire, no company. Just the trees and the road and the warm light burning steadily in the window of the chamber across from him, night after night, telling him without words that she was still in there and she was still alive. It was enough. He ate what was left of the food bundle she had given him, rationing it with the careful discipline of someone who did not know when more was coming. When it ran out, he found fruit growing at the edge of the settlement and ate that instead, and told himself the hollow feeling in his stomach was hunger and not the other thing, the larger, older hollowness that no amount of fruit was going to touch. The midwives noticed him on the second day. The younger one came out in the afternoon and stood at the edge of the road and looked directly at the trees with the focused expression of a woman who knew exactly what she was looking at. Seoryang stayed still. She crossed the road and stopped a few feet from where he was sitting. "Who are you?" she asked. "No one," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes moved over the burns on his arms, still visible beneath the herbs Adaiz had applied, still telling their story to anyone who looked closely enough. Then she looked at his face. "You brought her in," she said. It was not a question. He said nothing. She studied him a moment longer, making her own calculations. Then she said, "She is resting. She's going to be all right." She paused, and something softened very slightly in her expression. Not much, just enough to show that she was a person beneath the professional composure. "She is stronger than she looks." "I know," he said. The words came out before he could examine them. The midwife looked at him sharply, registering the certainty in it, the way it had arrived without hesitation, from a man who claimed to be no one. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then turned and walked back across the road without another word. She did not send him away. He stayed. The days moved slowly, and he let them. He slept when the night was deep enough, woke before dawn, and spent the long hours of daylight doing the only thing available to him, sitting with himself in the particular, unforgiving way that becomes unavoidable when there is nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. He had no past to revisit and no future to plan toward. He had only the present moment, over and over. And what the present moment kept delivering to him was the same thing it had been delivering since he first opened his eyes in this century. Questions he had no answers to. He thought about the ghost of power that kept visiting him. It came most often at night, when the settlement was quiet and his mind had nothing to occupy it. A feeling in his blood like the memory of a current that used to run through it, strong and constant, and no longer did. He would press his hand flat against the ground and try to reach for it the way you reach for a word that is on the tip of your tongue. And it would almost come. Almost. And then dissolve before he could hold it. What was I? He thought. On the third night, staring up through the canopy at the stars of this strange century. What did I used to be able to do? He thought about the night he had carried her here. The way he had run through the dark with her in his arms, feeling the urgency of it in every part of him. And beneath the urgency, beneath the fear, something else. Something that had wanted to do more than run. Something that had reached instinctively for an ability that was no longer there and found only air. If he had still had it, whatever it was, that night would have gone differently. He was certain of that, with a conviction that had no logical basis, and didn't need one. He would not have stood outside that building, pacing helplessly while she lay inside bleeding. He would not have been powerless against the husband's delay or the husband's cruelty or any of it. He would have been able to do something, to fix something, to reach into that night and rearrange it into something that did not end with her lying on a cot, being told by the man who married her that she was ruined. The thought sat in him like a stone. I had something, he thought, and it is gone. And she paid for its absence. He did not know why that felt true. He did not know why her suffering felt like something he was connected to in a way that went beyond having witnessed it. He only knew that it did, and that the feeling had been growing stronger with every day he sat in these trees, not smaller, the way feelings about strangers were supposed to grow smaller, with time and distance. This one was doing the opposite. On the fourth day, the older midwife came out herself. She walked across the road and stood in front of him with her arms folded, and looked at him with the direct, unsentimental gaze of a woman who had seen too much of life to be impressed by mystery. "You have been out here for 4 days," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are not her family." "No." "You are not from this settlement." "No." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "Then what are you?" she asked. And unlike the younger midwife's question, this one felt less like an inquiry and more like a test. Like she already had a theory and was giving him the opportunity to either confirm or complicate it. He looked back at her steadily. "I don't know," he said. And it was the most honest thing he had said since waking up in this century, because it answered not just her question, but all of his own as well. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she unfolded her arms and reached into the cloth at her waist and produced a small parcel, food, wrapped in the same broad leaves Adaze had used, and held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. "Don't read too much into it," she said dryly. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days, and I won't have a man fainting in front of my door. It's bad for business." He took the parcel. "Thank you." She was already walking back across the road. He ate and watched the window, and the days continued their slow passage, and he did not leave. On the morning of the 5th day, the door of the midwife's chamber opened, and she walked out. She looked different from the woman who had been carried through that door. Smaller, somehow. Not in height, but in the way she occupied space, like something that had previously held her upright from the inside had been quietly removed. She was dressed and wrapped, carefully, her posture straight with the effort of will rather than ease, and her face was composed in the particular way of a face that has decided composure is the only option left to it. The older midwife stood at the doorway behind her, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Seoryang was too far away to catch all of it, but he caught enough. She was telling Adaze to stay, or to go somewhere else, anywhere else. There were options, she was saying. There were always options. Adaze shook her head. Her voice was quiet. "You know the law," she said. "I cannot." "The law," the older midwife said, and the two words carried a lifetime of opinion about it. "I cannot," Adaze said again. She turned and looked at the road ahead of her. Something moved across her face then, just for a moment, unguarded, before the composure came back down over it like a curtain. It was not fear exactly. It was the expression of someone who knows exactly what is waiting for them and has decided that knowing is better than not knowing, and that going toward it is better than running from something that will find them anyway. She stepped off the threshold and onto the road. The older midwife watched her go, with the expression of a woman who has done everything she can do and is now at the border of what is hers to carry. Seoryang was already on his feet. He let her get far enough ahead that she wouldn't hear him, then stepped out of the trees and followed. He kept to the edge of the road, moving in the shadow of the buildings and trees that lined it, his eyes on her back, his footsteps quiet on the packed dirt. She walked at a measured pace, not slow, not hurried, just steady, like a woman putting one foot in front of the other, because that is the only philosophy left that makes sense. He watched the settlement receive her as she moved through it. A woman outside her door looked up as the days passed, and recognition flickered in her eyes. Beneath it, that terrible sympathy that never quite resolves into action. She looked away. A group of men talking near a stall went quiet as the days passed, and one of them said something low to the others, and one of the others shook his head slowly. And then they went back to their conversation. A child ran across the road in front of Adaze, and the child's mother snatched him back and held him close and watched Adaze pass with wide, careful eyes. Everyone knew. Seoryang watched all of it and felt the stone in his chest grow heavier with every step. She turned off the main road onto the familiar dirt path that led to her compound. And Seoryang slowed, keeping further back now, moving to the shadow of the trees that lined the path. She stopped when she reached the compound entrance. She stood there for a moment, just a moment, looking at the door of her house. Her hand rested briefly on her stomach, on the place beneath her hanbok where the scar was, and then her hand dropped and her chin came up, and she pushed the compound gate open and walked through. Seoryang settled into the shadow of the trees. He had been here before. This was the same spot, the same trees, the same view of the same compound, the same weight of waiting pressing down on him from above. He breathed it in and breathed it out and told himself that perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps the man inside had used these days to become something different. Perhaps loss had reached him in a place that drink and cruelty had not yet managed to destroy. From inside the compound came the sound of something breaking. Seoryang closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his jaw was set. Not different then. The sound of the husband's voice came next, raised and ugly, words spilling out with the reckless abandon of a man who has been drinking since morning and losing since before that. Something about money, something about gambling. The voice of a man drowning in his own failure and looking, as such men always look, for somewhere to direct the weight of it. Then the door swung open. The husband stood in the frame, and even from the distance of the trees, Seoryang could see the state of him. Disheveled, unsteady, his eyes carrying that particular unfocused heat that meant the drinking had moved past the numb stage and arrived somewhere volatile. He looked out into the compound and found her standing there. The change in his face was immediate. It moved through his expression the way weather moves. Fast and total. One thing replaced completely by another. The raging, flailing energy of a man undone by his own losses, sharpened into something more focused, more deliberate. His eyes moved over her with a cold, possessive displeasure. Like a man looking at property he has decided is not performing its function. "You came back," he said. Adaze stood in the compound and looked at him. She did not perform the careful, measured dance of managing him tonight. She was too empty for it, too spent. She simply stood there and looked at him with eyes that had already been through the worst night of her life and come out the other side and were no longer afraid of whatever this was going to be. "I came back," she said quietly. Something in her stillness seemed to agitate him further. He stepped out of the doorway and into the compound, and she held her ground, and Seoryang in the trees felt every step of it, like a countdown, his body already shifting forward, already reading the trajectory of what was coming. The husband moved, and this time there was no careful voice, no measured response, no performance of calm from a woman trying to prevent the inevitable. There was only the sound of it, sharp and hard, cutting across the quiet of the evening. And then her back hitting the compound wall, and then the husband reaching for her, his hands finding the front of her hanbok, tearing at it, and finding the scar. He froze. His eyes dropped to it. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man whose rage has found a new and specific target. He looked at the scar, and something moved through his face that was uglier than anything that had come before it, because it was not hot like anger is hot. It was cold, considered. The face of a man who has made a decision. His eyes came up to hers, and Seoryang was already out of the trees. Chapter 5. The Flood. He crossed the compound in seconds. The husband heard him coming and spun around, and for a moment, the three of them were frozen in the compound. Adaze against the wall, her hanbok torn, her eyes moving between the two men with the rapid calculation of someone trying to determine which direction the danger was going to come from. The husband stared at Seoryang with the unfocused, dangerous eyes of a man whose drink had been interrupted by something he hadn't accounted for. "Who are you?" he demanded. His voice was thick and loud, filling the compound with the particular aggression of a man who has decided that volume is the same thing as authority. What are you doing in my compound? Seoryang said nothing. He stood between the husband and a daes and looked at the man with a stillness that was somehow louder than anything the husband was producing. He did not explain himself. He did not justify his presence. He simply stood there, and something in the way he occupied space, something in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his silence, made the husband hesitate in a way that drink alone would not have made him hesitate. "Get out of my compound," the husband said. The volume dropped slightly, which made it more dangerous rather than less. "This is my home, my wife. Get out. Go inside," Seoryang said to Adais. He did not look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the husband. "You do not speak to my wife," the husband said. "You do not look at her. You do not." He moved, not toward Seoryang, toward Adais, a lunge sideways, fast and sudden, the move of a man who has decided that the most effective way to deal with an obstacle is to go around it. His hand shot out toward her, and Seoryang moved at the same moment, stepping into the path of it, and his hand caught the husband's wrist and stopped it dead. The husband looked at the hand around his wrist. Then he looked at Seoryang's face. And then he swung. Seoryang took the hit across the jaw, absorbed it, turned with it, and hit the husband back. The world cracked open. Not the compound, not the night around him. Something inside him. A fracture running through the hollow wall where his memory used to be, splitting it from top to bottom, and through the crack, a light so brief and so blinding that he staggered half a step. A flash, there and gone in less than a heartbeat. But in that less than a heartbeat, a road, sunlight, the sound of a market, and a face at the edge of it, turning toward him, there for just a fraction of a second before the compound came crashing back. He blinked. The husband was straightening up, touching his face where Seoryang had hit him, his expression moving through surprise and landing on fury. He said something, loud and vicious, and came forward again, leading with his shoulder this time, trying to drive Seoryang backward off his feet. Seoryang planted himself and took the impact and hit him again. The flash came back longer, the road again, clearer this time. A market morning, alive with noise and color and the smell of spices and open air. Himself on that road, younger, lighter, carrying something in his chest that felt warm and certain and completely unguarded. And beside him, gone. The compound, the husband's voice, the night pressing in from every direction. Seoryang breathed hard through his nose, his mind split between the present and whatever was trying to break through the walls of it. The husband had found the piece of wood propped against the compound wall, long and heavy, gripped now in both hands. And his eyes, when he raised it, were past the border of reason entirely. "I will kill you," he said, quiet, certain. He swung. Seoryang ducked under it, closed the distance in one step, and hit him with everything he had. The wood clattered to the ground. The husband followed it. He went down hard, the way drunk men fall, without instinct, without the reflexes to soften the landing. And he hit the packed dirt of the compound and did not move. The night went absolutely silent around them. Even the distant sounds of the settlement seemed to pause, the world holding its breath, waiting. And then the flood came. There was no warning, no gentle easing in. The wall that had been cracking since the first hit simply gave way all at once, and everything that had been held behind it came through in a single, enormous, unstoppable wave. Seoryang stood in the middle of his own compound and could not move and could not speak and could not do anything except stand there while centuries of himself came pouring back in. His name, his face, his city, his empire, the penthouse and the skyline and the careful, fragile piece he had spent decades building, the night of the fire, the burning, the ceiling coming down, all of it, every year of every century he had ever lived, every face he had ever known, every truth he had buried in the hollow space where his memory used to be, rebuilding him from the inside out with the force and speed of something that had been waiting a very long time to come home. He stood very still and let it rebuild him. And then it reached the part that took the breath completely out of him. Not the vampire, not the city, or the century he had come from. Earlier than all of that, this land, this settlement, this road, a girl, a laugh, a market morning that had changed everything. The memories assembled themselves with a precision that was almost cruel, each one clicking into place like a key finding its lock, each one illuminating the next, until the full picture was complete, and he was standing inside it with nowhere to look that didn't devastate him. He knew exactly who she was. He knew exactly what he had done. And he knew exactly what it had cost her. He stood in the compound with the full weight of it pressing down on him from every direction. The love and the guilt and the grief and the horror of understanding, all at once, the complete shape of what his decision had made of her life. It was too large to process and too true to deny, and it was all happening inside him in the space of seconds, while the compound stayed silent and the night stayed still, and the body of her husband lay on the ground between them. Slowly, he turned around. She was still against the wall. Her handbag was held closed with one hand, her other hand pressed flat against the mud wall behind her, her body still carrying the aftermath of what had just happened in every line of it. She was looking at him, had been looking at him, he realized, through all of it, with wide, uncertain eyes that were trying to make sense of what they were seeing. What they were seeing was his face, and his face was doing something he had absolutely no control over. It was not the face of a stranger standing in a compound after a fight. It was not the face of a man processing a moment of violence. It was something else entirely. Something vast and old and devastated, an expression that had no business being on the face of a man she had met less than 2 weeks ago, worn by someone who looked at her like he was seeing something the eye alone was not equipped to see. She stared at him. He stared back, and the silence between them was the loudest thing in the world. Chapter 6. Everything. The compound was silent. The only sounds were the distant chirping of night insects, the low whisper of wind moving through the trees beyond the wall, and the sound of Seoryang's own breathing as he stood in the middle of it all and was rebuilt from the inside out by everything he had lost. It was not gentle. Memory never is when it has been held back long enough. It came in like a tide that had been gathering itself for centuries. Wave after wave after wave, each one carrying more than the last, each one reaching further into him than he thought anything could reach anymore. He stood completely still and let it come because there was nothing else to do. There was no managing it, no receiving it in pieces. It simply arrived in its entirety and demanded to be felt. His name first. Seoryang, the shape of it in his own mind like a key sliding into a lock that had been empty so long he had forgotten what a key felt like. Then, his face. The face he had, looked at in mirrors for centuries, so familiar and yet completely lost to him until this moment. Then the city, the penthouse, the skyline, the company, the decades of careful, deliberate work building a world where his kind and theirs could share the same air without destroying each other. The night the fire came, the burning, the ceiling, the dark, all of it thundering back through him in seconds. And then, further back, much further, past the vampire and the centuries and the empire and the modern city. Past all of it. Back to the beginning of him. Back to the place and the time and the person that had existed before any of the rest of it was true. Back to here. This settlement, this century, this road. He had been young, human, uncomplicated by anything the world had not yet gotten around to teaching him. He had lived in this settlement his whole life, knew every road, every face, every story that the community told about itself. He had known contentment the way young people know it, without recognizing it as anything remarkable. The way you don't appreciate the absence of a wound until you have one. And then her father's trading caravan had come through. He remembered the morning they arrived, the caravan moving through the main road of the settlement, drawing the usual crowd of curious onlookers. And among the traders, a girl. A black girl with her father's eyes and her own particular way of moving through a space, unhurried and observant, taking everything in without performing the taking in. She had looked at the settlement the way a person looks at a place they are genuinely curious about, rather than merely passing through. He had been standing at the edge of the road with two of the other young men from the settlement, watching the caravan pass, when she had turned and looked directly at him, not at the crowd, at him specifically. And then she had looked away, completely unbothered, returning her attention to the settlement around her as though she had simply verified something she wanted to verify and was now done with it. He had thought about that look for 3 days. On the 4th day, he had found a reason to be at the market at the same time she was. He had manufactured the reason badly and transparently, and she had seen through it immediately. He remembered the way her eyes had moved over him when he appeared, that same direct, unhurried assessment. And she had said nothing about it, which was somehow worse than if she had called him out directly. He had bought something he didn't need from a stall near hers and pretended to be very interested in it. She had watched him pretend for a while. And then she had said, and he heard her voice now as clearly as if she were standing beside him saying it again. "You are not very good at this." He had looked up. "At what?" "At whatever this is," she had said, with the precise, devastating calmness of someone who finds the whole situation more amusing than they are willing to fully show. He had laughed. He had laughed because there was nothing else to do, and because the alternative was to die of embarrassment. And she had watched him laugh, and something in her face had shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. And that had been the beginning of everything. They had talked that morning, until the market emptied around them. They had talked the next morning and the one after that. They had found the long way between their separate parts of the settlement and walked it together every chance they got, filling it with conversation that moved easily between the serious and the ridiculous, between her observations about this new place and his opinions about everything in it, between the kind of honesty that only exists between people who have decided, quickly and without much deliberation, that the other person is worth being honest with. He had loved her the way you love something that makes the world make more sense, not with the desperate, grasping love of someone who is afraid of losing, but with the open, certain love of someone who has found something true and simply lives inside the truth of it. He had loved her laugh most, that full, unguarded laugh that she gave only when something had genuinely reached her. Not the polite smile she offered the world, but the real thing, thrown back and uncontained, aimed at him like a gift he had done nothing to deserve and everything to earn. He had been planning to marry her. They had talked about it. Carefully at first, in the oblique way of people who are not yet sure if the other person's vision of the future matches their own. And then, more directly as it became clear that it did. Her father had approved. The settlement had begun to accept the strangeness of them as simply part of the landscape. He had been building toward it with the steady, unhurried confidence of someone who knows where they are going and trusts the road to get them there. And then, the night came. He had been walking back late through the settlement, taking the long road because he was in no hurry to arrive anywhere that wasn't where she was. The figure had come out of the shadows with a speed that made no sense, moving the way nothing human moves, and he had had no time to do anything except understand that something was happening before the impact took him off his feet and the ground came up to meet him. And the thing at his neck was not a bite in any ordinary sense. It was a door being forced open, and through the door, something ancient, something that had no interest in who he was, or what he had been planning, or the life he had been quietly, carefully building toward. Something that simply arrived and took up residence in him the way a flood takes up residence in a house, completely, indiscriminately, with no regard for what was there before. He had woken up in the gray light before dawn and known immediately. The way the turned always know. The hunger that had no ordinary name. The heightened, almost unbearable sharpness of every sense. The understanding, arriving fully formed and requiring no explanation of what he was and what he was now capable of and what he would now always need. He had looked at his hands in the early light and understood that the man who had been walking the long road home thinking about a girl and a future and the specific happiness of someone whose life is going in the right direction. That man was gone. Whatever he was now, it was not that man. And the girl, his girl, with the laugh and the direct eyes and the way she said things that cut straight to the truth of whatever she was looking at, deserved a life untouched by what he had become. He had gone to her before the settlement woke up. She had been sleeping. He had stood in the doorway of the room where she slept and looked at her. The specific, ordinary miracle of her face in repose, unguarded the way faces are when their owners are unconscious, and the performance of existing in the world has been temporarily suspended. And he had felt the full weight of what he was about to do settle over him like something physical. He had told himself it was love. He had told himself that what he was about to do was the most loving thing he had ever done. More loving than the mornings on the road, more loving than the plans they had made, more loving than anything ordinary love could manage. He was removing himself from her life so completely that she would not even have the wound of his absence to carry. He was giving her a clean future, a future with no monster in it. He had reached into her memory with the new and terrible ability the bite had given him, and he had been thorough. Every morning on the road, every conversation, every plan, every laugh she had aimed at him like a gift. He had taken it all, carefully, completely, with the devastating efficiency of someone who has convinced himself that destruction and devotion are the same thing. And then he had left before she woke up. He had left this settlement and this century and this version of himself behind, and he had walked into the long, strange, centuries-long life of being what he had become. Powerful and untouchable, and completely alone in the specific way that only people who have chosen their own loneliness can be alone. And she had woken up without him. And the world had given her this compound, this husband, this life of absorbing cruelty and silence because she had learned that making noise only made it worse. The lost child, the scar she had been told to be ashamed of, the community that knew and looked away. All of it, every piece of the life she had lived in the space he had so lovingly, so carefully, so completely cleared for her. He had not set her free. He had handed her to this. The understanding of it landed on him with a weight that had no comparison. Not grief exactly. Grief was too small a word for it. Not guilt. Guilt was too ordinary. It was something that contained both of those things and went beyond them into territory that had no name yet. The territory of a person standing inside the full consequence of their own certainty, seeing it clearly for the first time, unable to look away and unable to change it. He had been so sure. He came back to the present slowly, the way you surface from deep water, the compound reassembling itself around him, the night coming back into focus, the body of her husband on the ground between them, and then her. She was still against the wall. She had not moved. She was watching him with those steady dark eyes, her handbag held closed with one hand, her other hand flat against the wall behind her. She had been watching him this whole time, watching whatever was happening on his face as the memories came back, watching the expressions move through him like weather, watching him become something other than the man she thought she had been looking at. And she was frightened, not of what had just happened with her husband, of him, of the look on his face that made no sense and would not resolve itself into anything she had a category for. "We have to leave," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rougher. The voice of someone who has just been through something interior that has no exterior equivalent. She stared at him. "Leave? Now. Tonight." He looked at the gate, at the road beyond it, his mind already moving through the practical geography of what needed to happen. "When the morning comes and they find him, you are the only one here. You know what the law will do with that." "I didn't." "I know," he said. "It doesn't matter. You know it doesn't matter." She did know. He could see that she knew. She looked at the body, and then at the gate, and the calculation moved through her eyes, rapid and unsparing. The calculation of a woman who had spent years learning to assess her own situation without the luxury of self-deception. "I have nowhere to go," she said. "We will find somewhere. You don't understand this place. A days." She stopped. He had said her name, and it had come out the way it used to come out, with the ease and weight of something said 10,000 times before, worn smooth by use, carrying in it the memory of every other time it had been said in every other register. It had come out of him before he could stop it, and it landed between them in the night air, and the silence that followed it was enormous. She stared at him. "How do you know my name?" Her voice was very quiet, very careful. The voice of someone who has just felt the ground shift beneath them and is trying to determine whether it is still safe to stand on. He looked at her. the full, true answer pressed against the back of his teeth. Enormous and devastating and far too large for this moment, for this compound, for this night that had already taken everything it could take from her. He could not give it to her here. Not like this. Not while she was still shaking from what had just happened and the morning was already threatening the horizon. But he could not say nothing. He could see in her face that nothing was not going to be enough, that she was standing at the edge of something she could feel but not yet see, and that whatever he said next was going to determine whether she stepped back from the edge or whether she let herself look over it. He thought about what she would know, what she would remember. Not him. She would not remember him. He had made sure of that. But the things around him, the details that existed in the world they had shared before he had taken himself out of it. He thought for a moment. And then he said, quietly, carefully, watching her face, "Your father used to say that a woman who walks with her eyes open will never lose her way. He said it to you every morning before the caravan moved. You used to say it back to him." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences of the night. She had gone completely still. Not the careful, managed stillness of a woman holding herself together. Something deeper than that. The stillness of a person whose entire body has just received information that the mind has not yet caught up with. Her eyes were fixed on his face. "How?" she said. The word came out barely above a whisper. "How do you know that?" He held her gaze and said nothing. He let the question sit between them because there was no answer he could give her right now that would not break something. And the morning was coming, and there were more urgent things than answers. But something was happening behind her eyes. He could see it. Something moving beneath the surface of them. Not a memory. Nothing as clear or as formed as that. Something earlier than memory. Something that lived in the body before the mind gets involved. The instinct of a person standing in front of something familiar that their conscious mind has no record of. The feeling of a door you have never opened, that your hand already knows the shape of. She was looking at him like she was trying to remember something she had no memory of. "We have to go," he said gently. "I will explain everything. I promise you I will explain everything. But not here, and not now. Right now, we have to move." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see the war in her. Fear against instinct. Caution against the thing moving behind her eyes that had no name yet. He waited. He did not push. He had pushed enough things in her direction without her consent. He would not do it again. She looked at the compound one last time. At the house. At the walls. At the gate. Then she looked at him, and she took a step toward him. It was not trust exactly. It was not the resolution of the thing moving behind her eyes into anything clear or certain. It was something smaller than trust and more significant. The decision of a woman who has looked at every door available to her and chosen the one that frightens her least, or perhaps the one that frightens her differently, in a way she does not yet have words for. She took another step. He turned toward the gate, and they walked out of the compound together and onto the road, and the night received them both, and behind them the compound sat silent in the dark with its dead and its secrets. And ahead of them, the road stretched into a darkness that neither of them could see the end of, to be continued. This is not the end. This is barely the beginning. Adaiz took one step towards Seoryang tonight. One step on a dark road, away from everything that tried to destroy her. but the truth of who he is and what he did and what it is going to cost them both to find their way back to each other. That is part 2. And part 2 is coming sooner than you think. Subscribe so you are here when it drops. Share this with someone who needs a story this powerful in their life. And before you go, tell me in the comments, whose story broke your heart more tonight? Seoryang's or Adazi's?